there's another genre of storytelling as well, and that is in the form of comic books. With us now, we are going to bring in Ken Quattro. He is the author of Invisible Men. I absolutely love your book and telling history through comics. Tell us a little bit more about this book and how you went about writing it.
Well, great. Well, thank you for having me on, Ronnie. Um, I've always been a comics fan going back many, many years. And I've written hundreds, if not thousands of articles and contributed to movies and books and everything about comics, and particularly comics history. And what I mean by that is I'm interested in the creators who actually create the comic books, not just the characters, but the actual people, the artists and the writers who create the comics. Well, about 20 years ago, I was interested in writing an article about a man named Matt Baker. Well, the only two things known about Matt Baker at the time were that he had died young and that he was a black man. And he was considered to be, by many people, the only black comic book artist who had worked in the 1940s, which is when comics really became popular. Well, that struck me as really odd because statistically that made no sense at all. How could there only be one black person, working in an industry? Anyway, I spent many years trying to track down information about Mr. Baker. And finally someone told me to contact this retired black cartoonist in Philadelphia named Samuel Joyner. Well, Mr. Joyner, I found his address and I wrote him a letter asking for information if he knew anything at all about Matt Baker. Well, I've done, like I said, research many, many times for many articles, and most of the time you get no response when you contact people blindly like this because they're hesitant, to just, provide personal information about anything. Well, Mr. Joyner wrote back a 4-page letter, a beautiful 4-page letter. And he not only described his personal experience meeting Matt Baker, but all these other black artists that he'd known. And he sent me newspaper articles and clippings about these different artists. Well, some of them worked in comic books, which is my specialty, but others were just cartoonists. Well, I was stunned at this information because as much as I knew about comics, I'd never heard of a lot of these men. So I wrote him back immediately and we developed like a relationship, and he gave me a little bit more information. And then I went from there. I tried to find more personal information about specific artists that he had mentioned. Well, none of the newspapers that I looked into, which I normally look into, the archives and, for newspapers like the News and the Free Press and the New York Times and stuff like that, had any information about any of these men, nothing. And I thought that was really curious that there was no information at all about these artists, because usually you can find information about people who have exhibitions or where they went to school or something like that when you start researching people like artists. Well, there's nothing about any of these men. So it struck me as I said, well, what about looking in black media? So I started looking for black newspapers. And unfortunately, the libraries in schools have never been good about retaining black newspapers for information. And there was hardly any that I could find. I would find runs of maybe a week or two or a couple weeks worth of newspapers, but no cohesive database of black information. So long story short, I spent 15 years locating all these newspapers and magazine articles and books. And it turns out that there was many more black comic book artists. And in the black media, a lot of these men were celebrated as fine artists. They'd come from fine art backgrounds. They'd been classically trained artists. And they just happened to have worked in comic books during the 1940s as basically a way to feed their families. And, it took, like I said, it took me 15 years to put this all together and find out that there was a blind spot that we had in our historical perspective about, the work of blacks in comic books.
It really is fascinating because history is told through the eyes of those that document it. And when you can't
Exactly.
find that documentation, those stories can go away. With that, Ken, during your research, what did you learn
Oh,
about some of these artists?
well, like I said, Ronnie, each one, there's 18 artists I profile in this book, and they're probably the 18 most well-known of the Black artists. Each one of them had a particular fascinating story. Like, for instance, there's one man named Elmer Stoner, and he had been uh, one of the artists during the Harlem Renaissance. He was a painter, and he'd been classically trained in Europe. He studied in the French Academy and everything. And in 1922, he came back from Paris and he settled in Harlem. And he actually participated in the very first exhibition of Black artists in the United States. It was held at the Harlem Library in 1922. And he became a very important figure in the whole Harlem Renaissance movement during the 1920s. Well, he had a relatively successful career working in white mainstream media as an illustrator. But come the 1930s, like a lot of artists, he found himself out of work because of the Great Depression. So he was the first Black artist, and I should say acknowledged Black artist, who ended up working in comic books in 1939. And again, he did it because they were only getting paid like $2 or $3 per page for doing this artwork, but it was a way of feeding, his family. And Mr. Stoner ended up being a conduit for other Black artists who entered the field after him. He would help them get jobs and stuff like that.
Yeah,
And
I'm
like I said,
thinking
he's
like,
just one. Yeah, he's just one of them. Each one of these guys had a unique story like that.
and you think now, like if you could find a page of that original art, how much
Well,
that
well,
would be worth,
well, if you
right?
see behind me, Ronnie, all this is original art, comic book artwork on the wall. Most of it's from that time period. So some of it does exist, but it's very, very rare, you know.
Were you able to find out anything about how they were treated um, during that period and how they were paid compared to some of their white counterparts?
Well, here's what's interesting about it, Ronnie. I have to back up a little tiny bit here. In the 1930s, the Roosevelt administration created the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. And the whole purpose of that was to give artists who were unemployed jobs, just work, give them something to do. And they ended up doing things like painting murals on post offices and working at the World's Fair and stuff like that. Well, around 1939, 1940, it was defunded by Congress. And most of the artists who worked for the WPA were minority artists, like Black and Jews. So all these artists found themselves without work. So what they did, they took whatever work they could find. And again, the comic book industry at the time was booming. Superman was created in 1938, and that just set the entire industry off. It was expanding like crazy. And what the comic book industry was interested in was just production. They just wanted as much material as they could. They didn't care what it looked like. They just wanted it done. So to feed that, feed that need, there was a thing created called comic shops. They were comic studios, and they were led by a guy who was called a packager. And he would go to the publisher of a comic book company, get the job, and they would say, like, we need 2 comic books by next week. And he would take it back, and he'd have a studio set up where it'd be all just lined up with tables, drawing tables, and a whole room full of artists. And these guys were getting paid like $2 a page. And they would crank out these comic books as fast as they could. They didn't care what they looked like. They just wanted them as fast as they could get them done. Well, the advantage for Black artists with these comic studios is that they didn't have to interact with white publishers, because what they could do is they would get an assignment from this packager. They would take it home and draw it in their own studio at home. Because several of these artists I've read, they said anytime they would go into a publisher on their own, they would never get an assignment. So what they would do is they would work through these packagers who provided a buffer between them and the actual publisher. But what happened by them working this way, Ronnie, is that many of the white artists in the studios never knew they were working with black artists because the black artists physically would not be in the studio. And they were invisible to them. And that's what created, for me, that's where I came up with the title Invisible Men, because they were actually invisible even to the people they were working with. So their pay scale was no different, but they weren't getting paid much at all. Like I said, $2 a page is nothing, even at that time.
Wow, it really is fascinating, and the research that you've done on this issue and in diving into their stories. What's one of the biggest discoveries that you made during your research?
Well, probably the thing that struck me most, Ronnie, like I said, I've always had a fascination with history, and I thought I knew quite a bit about history. But as I started researching for this book and I started reading black newspapers, I realized that there's other perspectives to history. Like you mentioned, you touched on, we have to see history from one perspective. And in this country, it's the white media perspective. But by reading the black newspapers, I've read thousands of them over this 15 years here, you see American history through an entirely different lens. And you're seeing events, the same events, covered in an entirely different way, like the 1943 Detroit riots. You look at it through the white lens. I don't know if you've ever heard much about them, but it was considered that the blacks were rioting, and the police arrested mostly the blacks and stuff, and there was something like 20 black men killed. But if you read it through the black media, what had happened is that it was a white group of white guys who attacked a black group, but the ones who ended up getting in trouble were the blacks. So it was over and over again, you get this different perspective. Like I told people, I said, I was almost ashamed in reading this because there's so much I didn't know. And you see things from an entirely different perspective. And, it was eye-opening for me. And that's what I try to get across in this book here, is to try to show people, there's other ways of looking at things. There's not just one way of looking at something, there's multiple ways of seeing things.
And that's such a valuable lesson, even today. So I know that your book was published just this past December, right? So what's it been like for you? Because how do you get out and try to do book signings during the middle of a pandemic?
It's been crazy, Ronnie. I mean, see, usually, like I said, I've written many things, and it's a very niche kind of field that I write for, just comic book fans. But this has gone crazy. I mean, the New York Times picked it up. I got a full-page article in the New York Times on January 3rd. Then the Free Press ran a full-page article about the book. And the media on this has been insane. I mean, literally almost on a daily basis, I'm getting calls from all over the country. I actually did an interview in the Philippines last week. But so I have to do everything over the internet, which is kind of strange for me. I'm a very reserved, private person, and to do this kind of stuff is kind of strange. I'm used to working by myself as a writer, and it's just a very strange experience, to have to do all this now.
So with that, if someone is interested in purchasing the book, how can they do so?
Well, Amazon is the most obvious way. I mean, but every book retailer has it. And personally, I would prefer if they would try to purchase it from a small business if they could, particularly like comic shops who are really suffering, right now. And most comic shops carry it, and you'd be doing them a favor if you would order through them. And if I could just show the cover real quick. I hate to do it, but my publisher loves when I plug the book like this.
No, absolutely. I have to tell you, Ken, my husband's upstairs, so I hope he's not watching this. He's an avid comic book collector, to the point where I'm like, we bought our house based on him having a comic book collection. But with that, this is going to be his Valentine's gift. So
great. Very good.
But yeah, they know him well at the comic book shops here in Metro Detroit. But I love the book. But I love the history and the stories behind it as well. It's been great having you on with us.
Well, thank you, Ronnie. I appreciate it.
We wish you continued success with the book. It's so many important stories, and I'm glad that you took the time to do the research and to share these stories as well.
Thank you.